And I actually had a dream one night that, so there's two versions of what would happen, but the dream was I looked over there in my dream and there was a guy there and he looked just like Mr. Burns. And for those of you who are just listening, I've got a bobblehead of Mr. Burns that Justin Castelli sent me after hearing the story, which is so thoughtful because now it's like, I've got a thing, right? But Mr. Burns is Homer Simpson's boss. And you remember him, he's got like these little fingers where he's always like looking down and in his nose, like he's kind of mean. In my dream, Mr. Burns was out there and he came in, he opened the door and he was like, what is going on in here? Is that a Sharpie? Is that card stuff? A Fujitsu Snapscan? Is this Utah? I mean, these are hills. You're a kid from the hills and wait till they find out, right? And then he'd ask other questions like who gave you permission to do this? Where's your permit? And then in my dream, there was a big giant, one of those big giant breaker switches like that you see like in a like giant building. It was a huge switch and it said on and off and it was in the on position and it was labeled, the switch was labeled Carl's career. And Mr. Burns reaches up, grabs the switch, looks at me, laughs and just turns it to off.
I like how he doesn't just turn your career off. He has to look at you and laugh at you first. Yeah, rub it in. That is some vivid imagery.
That was my dream. And so then from that time on, after that dream, every Thursday I looked over and I would just see like Mr. Burns standing outside my door being like, wait, who gave you permission? So then what happened was I was in, and I remember where I was my first big international, I was in South Africa in Cape Town. And there was it was my first event that was like 5,000 people. So it was my first event that was like stadium seating, and not stadium, but like theater style seating. And I drove up to the event and there was people out on the road towards the event and they had signs like, behavior app speak, Carl, some of them said Carl, and I was like, it was like pointing, they were just telling you where to park, but that's not what they were telling me. What they were telling me was like, oh my gosh. So then I drove in and I went to do the sound check and I walked out on the stage and I literally, like, there was no one there, but there was 5,000 seats. I literally turned around and was like, what? No, there's no way. But later on that night in the green room, and I'm almost done here, I recognized the same feeling. And then I realized like a couple weeks later, I was at another event and it was like 40 people, same feeling. And then I went on like a radio station, same feeling. And then I was like, when else have I had that feeling? And started to think back through all the things in my life that had gone, some of them didn't work, but that were like good. Like I remembered my wedding day, same feeling, like the birth of my first child, and actually all four of them, but certainly the first one, like what? Who thought this was a good idea? Like the start of a mountain bike race, right? And I'm in no way comparing those. I'm just saying the feeling was always there. So then I started to realize like Mr. Burns gets an invite to all the cool parties, right? Like, and so then I started to realize, and this to me is how I deal with imposter syndrome. Now, Thursday morning, I look over and if Mr. Burns is there, I'm like, hey, brother. Now you can personify imposter syndrome to be anything you want. It doesn't have to be a brother. It doesn't have to be him. But for me, it was Mr. Burns. Hey, brother, like, I'm glad you're back. You know what I mean? Like, that's what it became. Like, wait, if he's at all the good parties, why am I trying to shelter myself or protect myself from Mr. Burns? Why wouldn't I want to expose myself as often as possible with periods of rest? I've learned that with periods of rest in between to Mr. Burns events that Mr. Burns will be at. Because to me, that's the same feeling. Like the feeling is this might not work. It's new and novel. And that's the stuff I love. So that's how I did it. So last story, there's a story from the Buddha that he was teaching under a Bodhi tree. And there's a bunch of people there. And out in the back, in the bushes, like behind all the people, there was some ruckus. And one of his attendants came up and said, Buddha, Mara, M-A-R-A, I believe. Mara is like a mischievous devil. Mara is here. And the Buddha, and I love this, the Buddha reportedly said, "Oh, good, invite her in for tea." That to me is how we handle this sort of imposter syndrome now. Like, oh, good, I'm glad you're back. Let's get to work. Because the other way doesn't work, right? Elizabeth Gilbert says, it's like your crazy uncle. He can come on the trip, but he's never allowed to drive, right? And remember, the reason it doesn't work is because fear has kept you alive.
Right.
So the idea of like kick it in the teeth is kind of silly. Just don't want it to drive. So that's the whole story behind Mr. Burns. Greetings, Carl here. Thanks for listening to Michael and I talking like we do over at the Kitces Carl podcast. Rooney, so much fun. You know, there's another thing I do called the membership. And I'm going to invite you to take a 7-day free trial and just find out what it's about. In fact, you know what? I'm not going to say any more. Other than this, it's an invitation to attend a private conversation that you cannot hear anywhere else. Find out what I'm talking about by clicking the link and taking the free trial.